Hey folks, Dr. Mike Israetel here for Renaissance Periodization, asking a very strange question in today's talk. Is periodization important for muscle growth? Now, hold on a second. The company that pays my bills is got periodization in the name. I sure hope it's important. Well, let's find out how hypocritical I can be. So, first of all, what is periodization? We already have a problem right here. The formal definition of periodization in sports science is the manipulation of training variables to enhance progress, reduce injury risk, and time peak performances. Okay, that's all of training, actually. That encompasses the entire training process. So periodization is really another way of saying the modern approach to organizing training. But what most people think of periodization is not that. What most people think of periodization is the use of distinct phases, usually weeks long each, in sequence to accomplish some sort of long-term goal. For example, hypertrophy training, then strength training, then power training to become the best power athlete you can be. Like, that's what people say, that's periodization, right? And they're not completely wrong because it's a part of it, but it's just not the whole thing. Another way we can think about it is splitting up training into cycles is something that people think about as periodization. The microcycle, the mesocycle, the block, and the macrocycle. And that's essentially the same idea as this sort of phasic approach to training. Now, that actually has its own term. It's part of periodization. It's called phase potentiation. Phase potentiation is not all of periodization. It's just a small part of it, but that's what people say that's what they mean when they say periodization. So when people say, is periodization important in hypertrophy training or for muscle growth, what they actually mean to say is phase potentiation important? Because nobody thinks that organizing your training is not important for muscle growth. Of course, periodization is important. So this lecture should be titled, Is Phase Potentiation Important for Muscle Growth? We didn't title that because, you know what I'm saying, the YouTube algorithms will not be kind to that because nobody knows what the hell phase potentiation is. So, but now we're on the same page. We're using the colloquial definition of periodization, which really has a definition in sports science, is phase potentiation. The idea that doing one kind of training right now will improve your results in another phase of training later, will improve your results later, and so on and so on and so on. It's splitting up the training into distinct phases and blocks, which is known as phase potentiation. Now, what are the actual effects of phase potentiation in hypertrophy training? Okay, so phase potentiation sequences weeks in incrementally more difficult manner in an accumulation phase to form the actual accumulation phase. Phase potentiation says that what you do in 1 week changes what you're going to do in the next, and that sets up the next week. This is why we don't go all the way to crazy failure with super high volumes in week 1 of a program, because we know that week 2 leaves us nowhere to go. We know we're going to hold it back a little bit on the first week so that the next week is going to be tougher and more overloading, and then more and more and more, and then that sets up all the other weeks so we have great productive training. You can kind of think of it like a full course meal. The appetizer is good for its own sake, but it also sets you up for the sense experience. Fuck if I know. I don't know anything about fine dining, but I assume that the appetizer sets you up for the excellent main course. And then the excellent main course does its own job well, but it's also not too much food so that you have room for dessert. And the main course paired with the proper dessert, one sets up the next, and so on and so on and so on. So that's kind of how it works in training. The accumulation and deload phase sequence, so we have an accumulation phase and then a deload phase, that's an example of phase potentiation, right? Because the accumulation phase has to have a deload phase after it, and the deload phase before this next accumulation phase sets up the next positive accumulation phase. The sequencing of tougher and tougher mesocycles back to back to back. So a relatively high volume mesocycle, a much higher volume mesocycle where you go closer to failure and use more crazy stuff, and then one last mesocycle of a training block in which you do stuff that's just not sustainable for any more than one mesocycle, and potentially sequencing entire blocks of roughly 3 mesocycles with training blocks or training phases that are much easier to bring down tons of fatigue. So it's kind of like accumulation and deload that happens on a grand scale of easier mesocycle, tougher mesocycle, toughest mesocycle, that's a training block, sequenced with an active recovery phase, active rest phase, or a resensitization phase or something like that. So all of this is an example of what phase potentiation is in hypertrophy training, and the effects of it are very notable after years of applying it. Yeah, you might not be able to take any low volume or active rest phases for months and you'll be totally fine, but after years you will pay a price. And for the advanced, these effects are incredibly notable, and we'll get back to that later as to what that really means. However, for beginners, which are by definition people that haven't been trained that long, there's almost no effect. So if someone says, hey, do I need to phase potentiate as a beginner? I'm usually like, dude, just train pretty hard and work on really good technique and stick to consistency and adherence. If you get really tired, take a week off or a week of much lighter training. Again, there's some phase potentiation in there, but it's really just not that big of a deal, right? It's like getting a computer and you don't do any gaming or any high-end computing at all. And you're like, how important is the graphics card? Like, it's good to have a good one, but really you're not going to run into that problem, right? And for intermediates, in the medium term, in the case of like months, and remember almost all studies on this are on beginners for months, maybe weeks, and sometimes intermediates for months or weeks, there's almost no actual effect that's detectable, right? So this stuff only really shows itself after months and years, especially in the advanced. So if you're watching this and you're a beginner, I mean, it's cool to know shit like that, but if you're watching this for like, okay, how do I use phase potentiation in my own training? Don't even worry about it. So we already answered part of the question, is periodization important to beginners? Not really. To intermediates, you got to start kind of figuring it out. And then to advanced, yes, very important, especially in the long term. But if you're advanced and you only try it for a few weeks, which I don't even know what there is to phase potentiate much in a few weeks, then you'll be like, it's all periodization, it's all super overcomplicated, just train hard, brother. You're going to run into some problems, and we'll show you what kinds. All right. So if phase potentiation doesn't actually make a big difference for intermediates, what does make a big difference for intermediates? What should you be focusing as far as the whole background of periodization? If phase potentiation is not it, then what should be the focus? Well, of all the training principles, phase potentiation, here abbreviated as PP, and I posted this on my Instagram a while back as a preview, and everyone in the comments made PP jokes. So please feel free to make your best PP joke in the comments below. And I wish YouTube offered people the chance to comment with photos, because you could post a photo of your PP as well. I'll be posting mine later. So phase potentiation is actually second to last on a list of importance of training principles. And these are the training principles that are the totality of periodization. There's a whole bunch that come before that are way more important. And because intermediates need the more important stuff first, because the other details just haven't gotten to them yet, it won't make a big difference, we got to focus on the first three main training principles. That focus is going to be where intermediates get the most bang for their buck. They need to focus on specificity, overload, and fatigue management. What does this mean? I'll give you the most easy, quick, real-world definition of what these actually mean in hypertrophy training. For specificity, for intermediates, that means train the muscles you want to grow with exercises and techniques that target the muscles as limiting factors. So if you're doing curls and the reason you go to failure is because your shoulders are tired, no bueno. Or if you're doing rows and you mostly feel your lats, and your lats are what get tire out, and that's why you can't row anymore, and you're saying, I'm training my arms. Like, no, you're not. Okay, so for beginners, yeah, they can get big arms doing rows. Intermediates, when they're doing curls, it has to be like, oh my God, I feel this a ton in my bicep, and the reason I can't do one more rep is because my bicep is the limiting factor. That's how specificity applies to intermediates, and that's very, very important. Here's an example. People will say, hey, look, I'm doing tons of squats, like everyone said. When I was a beginner, it worked, but like squats just don't grow my quads anymore. What do I do? Well, as an intermediate, it's time to really focus on specificity. So it's time to ask yourself, do I feel my quads in the squat? Like, not really. I mostly feel my glutes. Are the quads what fail when I'm squatting all the way super close to failure? Like, no, actually my lower back just starts to get tired, and that's why I have to rack the weight. Well, gee whiz, you're doing a really bad job on specificity. That's the most important training principle. So it's no surprise your quads aren't growing. So either alter your squat stance or switch to another exercise as a first exercise that really taxes your quads. Maybe you switch to hack squats as a first exercise, still squatting, but later in the program. And it's just like every single set, when you get close to failure, your quads are it. They're the target, they're a limiting factor. You will get bigger quads that way. So it's super important that you get that right. Otherwise, you just float along for years, not growing certain muscles because you're actually violating the specificity principle, which is the most important principle of periodization. Number two, overload. It means train hard and make the training harder over time. And that requires a lot of mental fortitude. You may not want to lift 300 pounds because you used to be able to get bigger legs at 250. You got to go 255, 260. You got to do more reps, right? What did Greg Doucette say? Train harder the last time. Like, my Iago impression's not as good as it used to be. Gilbert Godfrey. But Greg Doucette, as much beef as we've had, he's got a great point, right? Fundamentally, overload means training harder. Maybe not than the exact last time, but look, over time, you got to train harder. If you look back to last August and the leg workouts you were doing were objectively more difficult than the ones you've been doing now, you can lie to yourself and say you're gaining a lot of muscle. You're not. And some people will literally say, and I've had people tell me this, like, dude, like, so to get my legs this size, I had to squat like 405 for a set of 6. What do I have to do to get bigger legs? I'm like, well, let's get the rocket surgery out and think more than that. It could be less weight, but way more reps. It could be different machines, but more reps, more challenge. And yeah, eventually that means you're doing crazy stuff. Remember, Marcus Rule, if YouTube him, if you don't know who that is, RUHL, I think, when he had one of the biggest chests of all time. He physically couldn't move his body around his chest. There's video of him Smith machine incline pressing like 5 plates for sets of 6. What the fuck? And do you think he would do that if he didn't have to do it to get a bigger chest? Of course not. But that's the only thing that got his chest bigger. So challenging yourself is the huge focus after making sure that the challenge is focused on the muscle itself. So specificity and then overload. And lastly, and a lot of intermediates miss this last part, fatigue management is crucial. And for them, that means, first of all, not training more than they can recover from. If you've tried 20 sets of chest for weeks on end and your chest just gets tired and you get weaker and you get hurt, stop doing that. Try 10 sets of chest per week and see if you can slowly work up to 12 or 15. That's much better. You'll get much better growth. So don't do more than you can recover from on an acute basis. And on a chronic basis, every roughly 4 to 8 weeks, you're going to have to take it easy. Either take a week off or take a week of deload to refresh and recharge and keep going. Intermediates who train specifically what they want with limiting factors as the muscles they target, who train hard and go over the course of time, make their training harder, and who don't exceed more than they can recover from until the last week of a mesocycle in which they deload and repeat, they're going to see awesome gains. Okay, that's the core. Don't worry about phase potentiation and all that other crazy stuff. Now, when does phase potentiation actually become more important? Well, just by sticking to specificity, overload, and fatigue management, you'll get amazing gains for years, maybe the first 5 years of your training career, maybe even longer. Now, eventually towards the end of that 5-year period, you'll have to start focusing on the training principles that are between the first 3 and phase potentiation, which is to say, you'll have to start thinking about SRA, stimulus recovery adaptation. In other words, you'll have to find a frequency that works for you for some muscles and maybe start altering your frequency a little bit here and there. Like, you can get great gains training your biceps once a week for a little while as a beginner, but as an intermediate, you might realize that 2 and 3 times a week bicep training just works way better. And somebody might have told you, here's a really great program where you train your hamstrings 4 times a week, but you can't do that because you can't personally recover from it. So you might have to adjust your frequency to 2 times a week or something like that. Variation, right? Variation is something you'll have to figure out. You'll have to choose the right exercises for you. You'll have to choose the right loading ranges or the fractions of the loading ranges you use. Do you train mostly heavy, mostly light, or mostly in between? And the right kind of tempos. Do you do slow eccentrics? When do you do those? And of course, knowing when to rotate them in and out. When have squats become stale? When have leg presses become stale? When is it time to replace with hack squats? So on and so forth. And of course, all of this is threaded in with individualization. Which one of these work best for you? Maybe not, on paper they work for everyone, but for you, some of them work really well, some not. So learning yourself is a big part. So you'll be doing a lot of that. But after a few years of doing all of that, but not doing phase potentiation, you'll notice a few things. Predictably, almost everyone does. Your deloads will no longer get rid of all of your fatigue, right? There's some psychological fatigue, some hormonal fatigue, and some joint and connective tissue fatigue that just hangs around longer than a week. And you'll realize that longer phases of easier training, 2 to 4 weeks of active rest or resensitization, will just be something you have to do, otherwise you won't be able to train hard continuously. After you come back from such downtimes, and if you guys want some insight on this, watch the Ronnie Coleman Joe Rogan interview where he talks about coming back full steam after time off and getting hurt right there in that first session. He said, I stopped doing that, and instead of squatting 600 pounds for reps the first time I come back from the gym after a long layoff, I went to 300 and then worked my way up, which is insulting. It's Ronnie Coleman. Why is he squatting 300 pounds? He realized he would just get hurt. You're going to start to realize that after you come back from downtimes, going full steam like crazy is a really, really bad idea. So your first mesocycle back, you'll train pretty hard, but ease into it. Your second mesocycle after that, you'll be able to train meat and potatoes like you always did. And then you realize that the super high frequencies and high volumes that you can handle, the very highest, can be done maybe for one last mesocycle, but then you're done and you have to take that active rest phase. So you can buy yourself a little bit of time to do your best, but then it falls off. So in the end, you're going to have rediscovered this phase potentiated structure. That's what you're doing, right? You are now taking longer phases of rest. You are coming back and sequencing mesocycles from easiest or least hard to more hard to hardest, unsustainable, relax and repeat. And now you're doing phase potentiation. You sort of just walked into it. And here's the deal. Almost all pro bodybuilders do it, whether or not they call it that. And most of them don't, because most of them don't have sports science degrees, but they don't need them because they've intuitively landed to this. Reminder though, science is still important because some folks, intuitively will land there and be successful. Some folks will get career-ending injuries or burn out completely before they ever do it. We have a survivorship bias. People say, well, the pros know it all. Well, yeah, the ones that are left over. But how many people, had they known sports science before, would have succeeded? But because they didn't, they have to discover the hard way. Remember, trial and error works really well if you succeed. Trial and error, if it's on an individual basis, means you tore your quad off your bone. You don't get to continue trial and error. So it's always good to have this knowledge ahead of time so that you don't have to discover it for yourself. But over time, bodybuilders on the aggregate, they have discovered this for themselves, and most do it. Most pros take 1 to 3 months off every single year, off of the gym and all their special sports supplements and all that stuff. Or they just do super easy training. A lot of guys just take that time off per year. Again, Ronnie Coleman, interview with Joe Rogan. A lot of people are surprised he took 3 months off after every single Olympia show period, and he needed it, right? Because he was pushing so hard, he had to have some downtime. And most pros, in addition to taking that much time off per year, sometimes all at once, sometimes in sequenced phases, most of them, when they start back easier. Then they have a distinct time when they're getting into their groove. And then lastly, usually before contest or at the end of a massing phase, they have a time when they know they are pushing unsustainably. And then they drop everything back down, rinse and repeat, and do that all over again. So the best already do phase potentiation, and you'll have to as well when you're close to that level. For now, if you're a beginner, intermediate, focus on specificity, overload, fatigue management, slowly work into training frequency and all that other stuff, and eventually keep your eye on phase potentiation because your body will let you know when it becomes super important. Folks, thanks for tuning in. See you next time.